In Rainer Forst's excellent text, Normativity and Justice, in the essay Reason, Normativity, and Power, he has the following quote. Once again, the advantage of a dialectical analysis of normativity with a twofold perspective becomes apparent. For the existing relations of justification must be analyzed in the first instance as power relations. Here it is decided who is able to influence the political space of reasons, to use it, occupy it, or even seal it off, possibly with an ideology. Therefore, power must be understood as essentially a mental phenomenon, as the capacity to bring others to think and do things that they would not otherwise have thought or done. Forst defines power as a mental phenomenon that is bound up and attached to justification. I don't think that we think about power enough. And I think it's one of the most important things that we could possibly think about. The idea of power as a mental phenomena leaves power in the domain of rationality to a very large extent. But of course, this can also be brought about. He says this can be the result of a good argument or of a threat. It can cause these conditions where it brings others to think and do things that they would not otherwise have thought or done. And the art of analyzing power is to understand, he says, how this occurs in concrete cases. Now that's very instructive. The art of analyzing power, it's an art to analyze it, is to understand how this act of coercion essentially occurs. Was it done through manipulation, through propaganda? Was it done through some type of physical threat or threat of suffering or imprisonment? Nonetheless, it's crucial that we think about power in relation to political action. And political action in the sense of trying to actually achieve a transformation within a social system. The failure of so many endeavors, resistance movements, is that they do not first begin by calculating power, which ultimately amounts to a calculation of an insufficiency of power and where the power essentially lies within a system. So responsible activism should calculate exactly what it is up against in terms of power. And from this understanding of what it's facing, it should try to determine whether or not the resistance activities that it wants to partake in is actually worth doing it. The reason is because if resistance activities are ultimately crushed by power, then it can be the case that the act of trying to alter conditions within a certain way fails. And it can fail in a multitude of ways. It can fail not just in the sense that the individuals involved are crushed by power. It can also fail in the sense that the cause is diminished because power essentially crushed it and it made the cause look exceedingly weak and incompetent, or it even made people afraid or discouraged them from engaging in such a process. The calculation of power is the first step in revolutionary activity, in resistant activity, nonviolent, resistant activity. Without this, we're dealing with revolt. We're dealing with impulse. We're dealing with individuals who they're not actually thinking about what they're doing. They're merely reacting. They become reactionaries to injustice, which is the easiest thing to do. The hardest thing to do is to step back and think about the system, think about the process, and try to find an ingenious way into the system so that the case can be made for change. That's the important thing, to find a space where resistance can work, where thought can work, where reason can work, where resistant activity can work to persuade and alter those mechanisms of power, those apparatuses of power, in such a way that the system and its power shifts back in the direction of freedom. So we're talking about the difference between a mindful activism versus a mindless activism, a rational activism versus an emotional activism. Thought is an extraordinary thing. If you apply it, it can show you the way. But you have to trust it. You have to know how to let it unfold things from within themselves. That's a dialectical critique. That's an immanent critique. And when that happens, the flaw in the system becomes apparent. It's not a clash from the outside. It's an internal flaw, a weakness that is seen from within the system.